Hello, welcome to Ref 21. My name is Derek Thomas, and I have with me Ligon Duncan, who's dressed in what Mark Dever calls his deer hunting outfit, or deacon hunting outfit, I think. Welcome.
I've never heard of a deacon hunting outfit. Well, it's nice to be here with you, Derek.
Today is December the 10th, and I was noticing yesterday that in the early 1530s, the King of France made an edict that Nicholas Cop, who was thought to have written a fairly virulent speech against Roman Catholicism, which had implicated John Calvin, the king had issued an edict that he be arrested, and it was on this day, December 10th. And it led us to talk a little bit over lunch today about how perhaps little of that spirit of being out there for the gospel, no matter what the cost. And I think you want to refer, because you've been referring a lot to this ever since you came back from Cape Town and the Lausanne conference, that you met a number of people and heard a number of stories of folk who have been martyred for the gospel. And just as a segue to that, we're all very familiar with Bonhoeffer's great sentence that he wrote just 2 or 3 days before he was executed by the Nazis, that when Christ calls on us to deny ourselves and take up a cross, he bids us come and die. And I think I want to make reference to the Stams, who were martyred 75
years or so ago this week. In fact, that conversation about assurance in Nicholas Cop led me to want to mention 2 things. One is the recent article that our friend Carl Truman has written for the Melias magazine that the Gospel Coalition publishes now online, issue 35, number 3. It's his article called, he has a section that he does there regularly called Minority Report, same title as his book. And it's titled Terrible Beauty, Beauty and the Plain Terrible. It's an excellent article, but it's a comment that he makes at the end that got me thinking as we were talking about Nicholas Cop and Calvin and assurance as an issue at the Reformation. And his comment is that one of the distinctives between Protestant theology and Roman Catholic theology in the era of the Reformation was the doctrine of assurance, and that the ground has sort of moved under our feet today. And that he believes that one of the reasons that you have so many evangelicals articulating a sort of the Reformation is over kind of statement is because of the context in which we find ourselves. He says if our context were more conducive to understanding the problem of assurance, there would be a greater highlighting of the differences between Roman Catholic and Protestant theological systems. And I think Carl is exactly right about that. He's, of course, not alone in asserting the uniqueness of assurance as a dividing line. We often talk of justification as a dividing line between Protestants and Catholics, and sola scriptura, and the whole issue of tradition and the authority of the papacy, and all of those things are different.
And it was
assurance.
Cardinal Bellarmine who said the greatest of all Protestant heresies is assurance.
And so Carl is, you have folks on both sides of the divide that highlight the doctrine of assurance. But it struck me because I'd had a conversation with a young person just a few weeks ago who had been listening to a retreat speaker talk about his struggles with assurance in his childhood. And this young person said, "Why in the world would you ever struggle with assurance?" And it struck me that, I can remember struggles with assurance in the early days of my own post-conversion life. And it struck me that we do live in a climate today, because we do not believe in the holiness and justice of God, and because we do not have a fear of hell, there is a lack of uncertainty about assurance for all the wrong reasons. And I think Carl is onto something as to why so many Protestant evangelicals are ready to give up their theological heresy, in their theological heritage, with regard to saying the Reformation is over, because we live in a context in which there is no crisis of assurance. And Protestant theology uniquely recognized the reality, I mean, that if you don't have a crisis of assurance, you ought to, unless you've settled it scripturally and according to a theology of grace. And we are dealing against a backdrop in which there are not the components there to create a crisis of assurance, and they're the wrong bases of that lack of assurance, of a crisis of assurance. So I thought that was very helpful to me in light of our conversation about Kopp and Calvin and the doctrine of assurance.
And that was issue number 35.
35.3. Themelios, an international journal for pastors and students of theology, or of theological and religious studies. Carl Trueman, Minority Report, Terrible Beauty, Beauty and Plain Terrible. It's the November edition of Themelios. But the other thing that you mentioned when we first started talking, and just about the lack of consecration that we see amongst ministers and those studying for the ministry in our time. I was struck again by this, reading a brief statement that had been written by an 18-year-old girl in the 1920s. And her name was Betty Stam. And she and her husband were married. They're both Reformed missionaries to China. She was the daughter of a Presbyterian missionary. He was the son of a Dutch Reformed family. And she, when she was 18, wrote these words: "Lord, I give up all my own plans and purposes, all my own desires and hopes, and accept thy will for my life. I give myself, my life, my all, utterly to thee, to be thine forever. Fill me and seal me with thy Holy Spirit. Use me as thou wilt. Send me where thou wilt. And work out thy whole will in my life at any cost, now and forever." Now, she was beheaded in China a decade, less than a decade later, just over 75 years ago. And those words, by the way, were the young Elizabeth Elliot found those words when she was 12 and wrote them in her Bible. And it struck me as I read them how alien that experience is to so many in our present culture who are both ministers and studying for the ministry. Not that lack of consecration. I think that's a great loss to us.
It was an emphasis that I remember hearing from Helen Roseveare, and the things she endured in her service as a missionary in Africa.
That's right.
Dear lady, godly woman, Helen Roseveare.
Yeah.
But perhaps a missing element today in the church. Well, with that thought, we would like to wish you all a very Merry Christmas.